welcome to another Read Aloud chapter. We will be reading chapter 22 today. And here is your thinking question. It's pretty easy to think about the point of view of the main character, but sometimes it's good to challenge ourselves to think about the point of view of someone who opposes them. So in this chapter, I want you to think about Cal's point of view. I want you to think about how he feels and try to figure out, why do you think he feels so strongly about what he's saying in this chapter? Try to get into his head and how he's feeling and why he takes the actions that he does. All right, let's get started. All right, chapter 22. Oh yeah, Hemlock is totally safe. The rebel group continued walking west until the sun was high enough to be burning the back of their necks. But no matter how far they walked, clankers followed, locked in on Aurella and Mavic. Okay, seriously? These guys can't walk with us anymore, Cal shouted, too fed up to hold it in any longer. On what grounds? Asked Bev. On the grounds that there's a group of at least 6 officers that have been following us for the last hour. I know the newbies have something to do with it. Like what? Another boy asked. I don't know. Maybe they're bounty hunters and they've been signaling for the officers to follow us so they can turn us in for reward money. Bev laughed out loud. That's ridiculous. Come on, have you ever seen that many bees along the streets looking at the same group of people? Cal challenged. Technically, I've never seen anything, Bev said. It was a rhetorical question. What I mean is that this isn't normal behavior for them, and I'm sure it has something to do with Mavic and Aurella. Mavic shook his head in anger. See how tense they are? Added Cal. They know they've been caught. Again, no, Bev said. It's really not that hard of a concept. Blind people don't see. You know what I mean, Bev. You know what, man? Said Mavic, rounding on Cal. You need to back off or you're going to end up smushed into the street. I'm not afraid of you, he growled, giving Mavic a shove. Aurella cringed. She watched Mavic flip from angry to livid in the space of 1 second. She bravely rushed between the boys. Stop it, she said, putting her hands in front of both their chests. This isn't how to solve things. She's right, Kayla said. Mavic, back off, Bev said, and Cal, this is exactly why we hesitated to bring you along. The boys scowled at each other and pulled their clenched fists to their sides. See, Aurella said, we can be civil. Let's just move on and forget that any of this happened. Mavic grunted. Cal scowled. Then a man ran right through their group, threw Aurella over his shoulder, and sprinted away. Aurella! Mavic shouted. Aurella beat her fists into the man's back. Let me go! No way, the man grunted, but Aurella could hear a smile in his voice. You seem like just the girl to win me a mighty fine bounty. You're crazy! Put me down, you creep! Nope. You're going to the chief officer, and he's going to give me enough gold to make me rich. I'm just a regular girl, I swear! Obviously. You think I actually believe in this witch business? He laughed. I just picked you because little girls are the easiest to restrain. Aurella was reluctant to manipulate in broad daylight. If she forced him to do anything, he'd know for sure that she was for real. Even if she knocked him out, as soon as he awoke, he'd know exactly who to find. Plus, this was Hemlock. The moment they knew she was a witch, dozens of clankers would be on her in an instant. They'd have posters made of her disguised face, and then she and Mavic would have to start all over again. But the sight of the carriage with bars over the windows made her panic. Put me down right now, she commanded. The bounty hunter did exactly as she instructed, but before she had time to run away, the man took a handkerchief from his pocket and tied it over her mouth, so tightly it was painful to even try to move her jaw. Then the clanker threw her back over his shoulder and continued running. Aurella mentally scolded herself. She wasn't specific enough in her instructions. She told him to put her down, but didn't specify for how long. Now, not only was she captured, but she no longer had the ability to manipulate because she couldn't speak. Get in there, sneered the bounty hunter, setting her down in front of the carriage. Wait, I forgot. He pulled her hands behind her back and tied them together. There, he grinned. He threw her inside a carriage, closed the doors, and locked them. Aurella was completely trapped. The bounty hunter went to the front of the carriage to drive the horses forward. And there Aurella sat, finally captured, heading to the death that had awaited her all along. The carriage swiftly bumped along, away from her new friends, and away from Mavic. They had been driving for what felt like forever when the door opened and Aurella was thrown to the carriage floor as a girl was shoved onto the seat she'd been sitting on. A third was piled in next to her. Aurella heard the door close and the click of the lock. The two girls scrambled onto the seat and Aurella sat up. One of the girls was no more than 5 years old, and the other was maybe a year older than Aurella. The older girl pulled her knees to her chest, crying silently. The smaller girl gripped her arm for dear life and bawled loudly. Though teeming with sympathy, Aurella felt it appropriate to interrupt their crying. They were not bound and gagged, so she held her hands out behind her back while yelling at them through the handkerchief. But they were too caught up in their own fear and sorrow to comprehend the fact that another person might need their help. Aurella growled in frustration. This was the worst way to die. Here she was, trapped in a carriage with two stupid, though innocent, girls, who she had the power to save, yet she couldn't because of something as stupid as a handkerchief preventing her from using her powers. And Mavic wasn't even here with her. Aurella let out a small whimper as she leaned against the carriage door. Suddenly, the sound of shouting voices and the clomping of horse hooves jarred her from her self-pity. She struggled to climb back onto the seat so she could see out the rear window. She could barely see through the dust the horses were kicking up, but it looked like a carriage was racing toward them. A clanker drove the carriage and shouted angrily for them to stop. Aurella felt the carriage slow down. This was it. They were about to be turned into the clankers. She had to do something quick, but before she had time to think of anything, the bounty hunter opened the door, yanked her out, and held her out in front of him. "I've got one for you," he shouted. "Give me my gold." People on the street stopped for a moment to take in the scene. Some continued to stare nervously, but others walked on. Apparently, this happened enough that it was no longer a major occurrence, and they had to have enough sense not to intervene and get captured themselves. The girls in the carriage cried and screamed, awaiting their turn to be handed over to the clankers. The officer driving the carriage jumped to the ground and strode toward them. He signaled for the bounty hunter to follow him into an alley to discuss matters of payment in private. The bounty hunter locked the two other girls in the carriage and followed the clanker, dragging Aurella behind him. They walked deeper and deeper into the alley until they could barely hear people on the streets. Finally, the officer stopped with his back to them. The bounty hunter walked up to him. "So what's my payment?" he asked impatiently. The clanker whirled around and punched him in the face. Aurella fell to the ground with him. His arms released her and she scrambled to her feet. The man was out cold, with just one punch. "What the—" "Come on, Elf," the clanker said, untying her hands. He quickly grabbed her arm and sprinted forward, pulling her behind. Aurella used her free hand to untie the handkerchief from around her mouth. "Mavic?" she exclaimed. He looked back at her and grinned, taking off his helmet. "Didn't recognize me? Apparently not all disguises require creepy witch manipulation." "How did you—" "I'll explain back in the carriage, but we gotta move before anyone else carries you off." They hastened back to the carriage Mavic had been driving. He opened the door and helped her inside. "Wait!" Aurella held the door open before he could close it. "There are two other girls in the carriage." Mavic sighed impatiently. "Good thing I nicked that idiot's keys off him." He ran to the carriage, and as soon as he opened the door, the girls jumped out and dashed into the street. Mavic hopped up to the driver's seat of their carriage and urged the horses forward. "Might want to close that," said the red-haired boy sitting next to her. He reached over and pulled the door shut. "Long time no see," said Bev. She heard his voice but couldn't see him because there were so many kids in the carriage. "Glad he didn't get carried off and hanged." "Me too," Kayla said. Her hand reached out from the tangle of limbs and patted Aurella's knee. Thanks, Aurella said, too stunned to say much else. That friend of yours is insane, said the kid next to Aurella. I'm aware of this, Aurella laughed. What do you do this time? Wooly. No, let me tell it, Bev interrupted. He leaned forward enough for the top of his head to peek out from behind another kid's shoulder. So, once you get carried off, he finds a clanker and goes right up to him. Then he says, I found a witch. She's hiding over there. And then he leads him into an alley between houses. Comes back out alone, wearing the officer's clothes. Then he shoves the guy's helmet on his head and runs up to a carriage driver, pulls out his sword and says, The city of Hemlock requires your carriage. The driver puts his hands up in the air and jumps off the carriage without question. Then you all jumped into the carriage and started looking for me? Aurella asked. Yep. What took you so long? We had no idea where you were, Kayla said. We had to ask around if anyone had seen a bounty hunter riding through the streets. It took us a while to find the right one. Yeah, your pal here had a fun time sticking his fist in people's faces demanding information, someone laughed. Aurella smiled, and her heart melted. Mavic went through all that trouble just to find her. How did she get so lucky to have a friend like him? They rode on through Hemlock in the carriage, despite the insane lack of personal space. Aurella's capture and rescue had taken them off course, but with some luck, they hoped the carriage might get them to the palace on time. Mavic continued to drive. No one felt brave enough to cut short his pretending to be a clanker. He'd already started insisting that everyone call him Officer Mavic. When the palace was in sight, they abandoned the carriage on the side of the road and walked the rest of the way. Mavic reluctantly left his armor behind in the carriage. Soon they stood right outside the iron palace gates. The palace stood majestically, sparkling in the sun, with towers so tall that Aurella had to crane her neck to see the tips. So, Bev grinned, rubbing his hands together, let's do this. All right, that is the end of chapter 22. Chapter 23 is called How Someone Had to Ruin It All. Wonder how they're going to ruin it this time. So, just a reminder, your thinking question is to think into Cal's point of view. How do you think he's feeling? Why do you think he's doing the things he's doing? And why is he so passionate about it? Because obviously, everybody has a reason for the things that they do. And everyone thinks that they're doing the right thing. So, think into Cal's perspective. Why does he do the things he does? And what do you think he's thinking and feeling? All right, I will see you guys next time. Bye!